If you want to understand the sheer, unadulterated chaos of Portuguese history, don't look at the dusty statues of guys in metal pants holding crosses. Instead, look at April 25, 1974. Picture this. A bunch of weary soldiers in Lisbon decide they've had enough of a 40-year-old dictatorship that felt like being stuck in a never-ending Sunday school lesson led by an economics professor. They roll their tanks into the city center, but instead of a bloody Call of Duty level, they get a flower festival. A woman named Celeste starts shoving red carnations into the muzzles of their rifles, and the soldiers just shrug and go along with it. In a single afternoon, the oldest colonial empire on the planet global corporation that had been disrupting markets from Brazil to Nagasaki for 5 centuries just decided to file for bankruptcy and go home. It was the ultimate corporate liquidation. And they did it with the grace of a man quietly leaving a party he realized he was never actually invited to. This is the paradox of Portugal. They are the world's most successful accidental superpower. They spent 500 years trying to own the ocean only to realize that the ocean is a terrible long-term investment. Today, the world sees Portugal as a chill, affordable paradise for digital nomads and surf bums. But if you look closer, you realize you're standing in the wreckage of the most ambitious, most delusional, and most strangely resilient startup in human history. To get why they are the way they are, you have to look at their office space. Portugal is basically a narrow balcony facing a 3,000-mile void. If Europe were a crowded apartment building, Portugal would be the guy living in the tiny studio by the emergency exit, with a very loud, very aggressive roommate named Spain taking up 80% of the floor space. For the longest time, the Portuguese were effectively ghosted by the rest of the continent. They were tucked away behind rugged mountains, forgotten by the big players in Rome and Paris. This isolation didn't make them soft. It made them desperate. They had no gold, no massive wheat fields, and no neighbors to trade with who weren't trying to annex them every Tuesday. So they developed a startup mentality. When you have your back against a wall and your front against a literal abyss, you don't play by the rules. You invent a new game. This is where the Portuguese identity was forged as Europeans, but as edgewalkers. They are the only people who looked at the Atlantic and didn't see a game over screen. They saw a loophole. But wait, the origin story is even weirder. Around the 12th century, Portugal didn't even exist. It was just a vassal state, a side hustle for the Kingdom of Leon. Then comes Afonso Henriques, the original disruptor. This guy was so determined to be his own boss that he fought a literal war against his own mother. Can you imagine that on Tinder? Interests, sword fighting, long walks on the beach, and overthrowing my mom. He beat her at the Battle of Snowmammid in 1128 and told the Pope, "I'm a king now, deal with it." This set the tone for the next 800 years. A tiny, scrappy nation punching so far above its weight class that it's a miracle they didn't break their own arms. While the rest of Spain was still busy with the Reconquista, trying to evict the Moors in a 700-year-long tenant dispute, Portugal finished its borders in 1249 and just sat there. They were the first country in Europe to actually complete their nation-state download. But once the download was 100% finished, they realized they had nothing to do. It was like finishing a video game and realizing there are no side quests left on land. So, they looked at the water. This is where the story shifts from a family drama into a high-stakes venture capital pitch. Enter Prince Henry the Navigator, the 15th century version of a Silicon Valley angel investor. He didn't actually sail much himself, he was more of a tech lead. He gathered the best nerds in Europe, cartographers, astronomers, and shipwrights in a town called Sagres, and told them to build a killer app. That app was the Caravel. Before the Caravel, ships were basically floating bathtubs that couldn't handle the Atlantic's attitude. The Caravel was a sleek, maneuverable beast with triangular sails that allowed the Portuguese to tack against the wind. It was the iPhone 1 of the maritime world. Suddenly, they weren't just hugging the coast of Africa. They were exploring it. And why? Because they wanted to cut out the middleman. The Venetians and the Ottomans had a monopoly on the spice trade, charging 500% markups on pepper and cinnamon. The Portuguese decided to build their own global supply chain, a direct-to-consumer spice route that skipped the Mediterranean entirely by the time Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498. The Portuguese were basically the Amazon of the Renaissance. They weren't interested in colonizing vast tracts of land. They didn't have the manpower for that. Instead, they built Vitoria's armed trading hubs that functioned like high-speed Wi-Fi hotspots for the global economy. They grabbed Hormuz, Goa, and Malacca, effectively putting a toll booth on the world's most valuable trade routes. This was the Golden Age, but it was a golden age built on a massive lie. While the king in Lisbon was literally bathing in pepper and gold, the actual country was falling apart. It was a classic case of resource curse. Why bother learning how to grow wheat or build factories when you can just buy everything with the profits from a boatload of cloves? The Portuguese nobility became a rentier class. Living off the passive income of an empire they were spread too thin to protect. They were a global superpower with a domestic economy that was essentially 3 guys and a goat. Then, the management crisis hit. In 1578, King Sebastian the Young, delusional royal who probably had main character syndrome written all over his journals, decided to lead a crusade into Morocco. He didn't bring a backup plan. He barely brought a map. He and his entire army were vaporized at the Battle of Alcázar Quibir. But here's the kicker. His body was never found. This triggered a national psychological breakdown called Sebastianism. For the next few centuries, the Portuguese people convinced themselves that the hidden king would return through the fog to save them. It's the historical equivalent of waiting for a product update that is never, ever coming. Because Sebastian died without an heir, the King of Spain, the very roommate they'd been trying to avoid, simply walked in and acquired Portugal in a hostile takeover that lasted 60 years. They were ghosted in their own country. When they finally regained independence in 1640, the world had moved on. The Dutch and the English had copied their app, improved the UI, and were now outcompeting them everywhere. If you think that was bad, wait until 1755. Imagine it's All Saints' Day. Everyone is in church, lighting candles. Suddenly, the earth decides to have a seizure. An 8.5 magnitude earthquake levels Lisbon. Then, the people run to the docks to escape the falling buildings, only to see the ocean disappear. 10 minutes later, a tsunami wipes out the rest. Then, just for flair, the candles in the ruins start a firestorm that lasts 5 days. It was the ultimate force majeure. The most religious city in Europe was destroyed on a holy day. While in a touch of cosmic irony, the red light district on the hills survived almost untouched. This event didn't just break the city, it broke the European Enlightenment's brain. But out of the rubble came the Marquis of Pombal, a man so ruthless he makes Gordon Gekko look like a saint. He rebuilt Lisbon on a grid system, invented earthquake-proof architecture, and told the grieving nation to bury the dead and feed the living. He was the turnaround CEO Portugal needed, but he did it by turning the country into a police state. The 19th and 20th centuries were basically Portugal trying to pivot and failing. They lost Brazil their biggest subsidiary in 1822, which was like Apple losing the iPhone. Suddenly, the motherland was just a small, poor country again, trying to look important. By the time the 1930s rolled around, they were so exhausted by political chaos that they let an economics professor named Salazar take over. He ran the country for 36 years like a very strict, very boring boarding school. His Estado Novo was built on the three F's: Fado, Fatima, and football. Basically, be sad, be religious, and watch sports. He kept Portugal pure by keeping it poor, illiterate, and isolated, while the rest of Europe was getting into rock and roll and the space race. Portugal was still trying to fight colonial wars in Africa to keep a brand image alive that had been dead since the 1600s. It was like a guy in his 60s still wearing his high school varsity jacket and wondering why nobody wants to hang out with him. Which brings us back to the flowers. In 1974, the soldiers realized that the varsity jacket was full of holes and smelled like mothballs. The Carnation Revolution wasn't just a political change. It was an exit strategy. Portugal finally accepted that it was okay to be a small European nation. They gave up the colonies, joined the EU, and decided to focus on what they were actually good at: wine, seafood, and being insanely hospitable to strangers. But you can't just delete 500 years of explorer DNA from your hard drive. It lingers in the saudade, that specific Portuguese melancholy that feels like a longing for a future you already lost. You hear it in the fado houses of Alfama, where people sing about the sea as if it's a toxic ex-lover they still secretly check on Instagram today. Portugal is a success story, but it's a weary one. They've gone from being the first globalizers to being a sanctuary for people trying to escape the very globalization they started. They've survived earthquakes, hostile takeovers by Spain, and 40 years of being put on mute by a dictator. They are the ultimate survivors of the hype cycle. But as you walk through the streets of modern Lisbon, seeing the tech hubs and the luxury hotels, you have to ask yourself, is this the final version of Portugal? Or are they just in sleep mode, waiting for the fog to roll in and for the hidden king to return on a surfboard? After all, when your entire history is a series of impossible gambles on the horizon, stability starts to feel a lot like a trap. So, the real question isn't whether Portugal has changed. It's whether the edgewalkers are actually happy on solid ground, or if they're just waiting for a reason to jump into the void one more time. Does a nation that once held the whole world in its hands ever really learn to be satisfied with just a slice of it? Or is that lingering saudade actually just the sound of a country holding its breath?